Hi everybody, I'm Chris Yawn. Welcome to Grow My Church. It's a place where dynamic and innovative ministry leaders come to tell the success stories behind their work so that others can learn from their experiences. And with me today is a very well-known man in the world of church consulting and leadership development. He's an author and a consultant who's done much to further the cause of Christ by calling us to be more missional. His name is Alan Roxburgh, and he works with the Missional network. And Alan, welcome to Grow My Church. And why don't we start right there? What characterizes a missional church?
Well, there are many things that characterize a missional church, but one of the simplest ways to describe it is to ask where is the energy of this church? And very often, the energy of churches is in trying to figure out how to design themselves so they can get people to come to them. A missional church has a different focus or energy. Missional church is asking the question, what is God up to out in the neighborhoods and communities where we live? How do we discern that, and how do we join with what God is up to? That is more about what a missional church is. It's about God as the agent, so it's not primarily about how to get people into the church as much as how we enter our neighbors and communities to discover what God's up to.
So a big part of the church's mission is discernment.
A huge part of the church's mission is discernment. How do we attend to and listen to the ways in which the Spirit of God is at work amongst us and in our communities?
And I imagine with your consulting and certainly with the corpus that you've put together in terms of your writing, you talk about this frequently, and you're familiar with the ways in which the challenges which churches face today, especially older established churches, in trying to retool and begin to listen again. Would you talk to us a little bit about this sense of discernment and how churches would be about engaging this?
Sure. In many established churches, and let me just phrase what I'm going to say by saying this, that a lot of established churches today feel like they've been put on the shelf. They feel like they've somehow lost what they used to have. And it's true. But at the same time, I want to say that these are the very places where God is at work. And therefore, when I speak these things, I speak them with a great deal of hope and anticipation. Because God always turns up in the places that we give up on. And that, to me, is a wonderful description of a lot of congregations and churches today. So how do you go about discernment? Well, there's a couple of really big things here. One is that too often in our churches, we've tended to become kind of ingrown. And we sort of know each other and know each other's stories, and we've been around a long time. And you know, the truth is, in a whole lot of ways, we've even forgotten how to listen to one another. We've forgotten how to hear God and the Spirit of God in the midst of one another. I'm used to a lot of churches where people come and meet and they can finish each other's sentences before they're done. So there's a whole pile of work to be done on how we learn to just listen to one another and hear again the stories that are present of God's activities in a congregation. Secondly, we've really lost the capacity, and this is going to sound strange, to let the Scriptures speak to us. I call it allowing Scripture to read us. Very often the Bible inside a church has become a book that we all know, or we're all supposed to know, or it's in the hands of professionals who know it and tell it to us. So there's two things that I do. One is I want to cultivate an environment in which the people of a local church, whether they're 95 years of age or 25 years of age, are learning to just listen to one another again and hear God's stories in one another. And secondly, are learning a whole new practice of sitting before Scripture and allowing it to speak to them. We call it dwelling in the Word. but it's the ancient practice of lectio divina. These are two crucial precursors to our learning how to listen to people in our neighborhoods and communities. Because if we can't do it ourselves, we won't be able to do it out there. So that's where discernment begins.
And you look at the ways, Alan, that a lot of churches are set up with our prescribed liturgies and our traditions and the ways that we've been community together, and that almost seems antithetical to what you're describing.
It's yes, a lot of the liturgies. I'm an Anglican, and frankly, in many ways, that liturgy is a wonderful gift if it is understood and done well, because it moves us into the mystery of the agency and the activity of God. But I find a lot of liturgies, and for many years I was in a different denomination. I find a lot of liturgies fail to draw people into what I would call a God center. They fail to draw people into the awe and the presence of God. So a lot of music, I call it Jesus is my boyfriend music. It isn't, and it's got nothing to do with style or instrumentation. It's the focus. So liturgy can be an amazing gift to focus us upon God's presence and enable us then to enter spaces of discernment.
Talk a little bit more about that Jesus is my boyfriend music, and the ways that that perhaps some of the things that congregants love to hear might be detrimental to entering into what you're suggesting.
Sure, that's a big question, and hard to answer in a brief period of time.
Take your time.
Yeah. I was at a conference several months ago in Southern California, and before I was leading it, there was a worship time built in, and they were singing a hymn, a very ancient hymn, "Be Thou My," I can't remember the "Be Thou My Vision, O Lord of my life," but the tune had changed, and so the melody was very, very different. And I couldn't quite understand it for a while, because here was a hymn that in all of its words was directing one towards God, and what God was about. But somehow there was something amiss, and I began to realize that the actual melody, the music itself, was doing something entirely different. It was really directed towards me having what I call an affective experience. And I began to realize that in many ways, the music form is way more powerful than even the words. And that what's happened in contemporary society is that as people become more and more isolated and disconnected, they become more and more hungry for some kind of intimacy and connection. So that music, unintentionally, has really become a vehicle for what I call expressive individuals with very thin relationships, trying to find a way to have a momentary experience. And it wouldn't really matter whether God was there or not. So that's what I'm talking about. And then secondly, in the midst of that, a lot of the contemporary language, if you listen to it, is not about God, it's about the first person pronoun. So we've got to do some work here at understanding the hunger of our culture, but not giving the culture that hunger in terms of some kind of intimate personal experience, because at the end of the day, it doesn't heal, it doesn't solve. Am I making sense?
You are making sense, because I think what you're describing is certainly the music or even a liturgy that might appeal to one set of senses, which is safer than really opening ourselves up to what it means to be Thou my vision, and to connect at a deeper level with the real human need and yearning that's out there.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And And you know what? It could be a very fine line, but it's a real one. And I think that too much of our liturgy, irrespective of the church's theology, is driven more by what I would call the the consumer who's seeking an experience, than it is taking that person and directing them towards God.
And you can see how that, I mean, at least in North America, you can see, because we're fish swimming in a consumerist society in the water around us. And to haul that off to church is not a big step.
It's very difficult. I would not pretend it's easy.
Well, I want to get back to the points that you made, because they're very big points about listening and discerning.
Right.
And you mentioned cultivating an environment in which people can listen to one another.
Right.
And how what is a gathering of Jesus people on a Sunday morning or whenever else look like in light of that?
Oh, it can look like lots and lots of things depending upon the tradition. Let me use some different language. One of the things I've learned in talking with people in the neighborhoods and communities around here is that, and most of them don't go to church. In Canada, I live in Vancouver. You have a very, very low church attendance, maybe on a good day, 7 or 8%. One of the things they'll tell you is church is not a safe place. And so one of the critical things to do is ask, how do you create safe spaces? And Sunday morning may not be the place, well, it's one of the places where you start, but there's got to be a lot of other places. So I, as a leader, have to keep thinking in everything I do, in the liturgies I put together, in the ways I communicate, in what people are seen to be doing, how does this is constantly communicating to people, this is safe space. I think one of the most powerful biblical metaphors of that is the table. That the table is always the place where one is welcomed, one gathers, where bread is broken. So we have a lot of the symbols and the resources for doing that. So that would be one thing. Secondly, if we're talking about liturgy, and again, it depends upon one's tradition, I think it's critically important to ask, who is seen doing what? Is what's happening here, what's being communicated here? Is being communicated here that we have an hour and 5 minutes in which to get through X number of events, all very carefully timed, all driven by certain kinds of media inputs, all focused upon a particular person who has a sermon to preach? Or are we focused upon something very different than that? So that's also a question of creating safe space. A third thing has to do with the kind of communication that goes on. My dog is going to bark right now because somebody's come to the door, so I'll just let you know that.
Hey, you know what? That's the authenticity of the new age of church, isn't it, Alan?
Yeah. I travel to, I'm in a lot of churches on a Sunday morning, so I see churches not just across North America, but around the world. And here's what I'll tell you right now. It's all one-way communication. It is all telling people how they can join this church and do something in this church. It's all about the programs, the wonderful programs this church is offering you. But all the communication is one way. And what that constantly communicates, maybe not intentionally, what it constantly communicates is that A, I'm a consumer, and B, I really have nothing to offer unless I plug into what's going on. And so what this does is it removes the very place where God's imaginative life is present, which is amongst the ordinary people of God. So I would say that to a very large extent, much of what we do shuts down those very people in whom God's future is present. I think one other thing, and I'll stop. In my experience, the vast majority of clergy live their lives inside what I call a church bubble. They know church people, they go to church events. A lot of clergy have conversations only with other clergy. Yeah. And to that extent, they have little capacity to demonstrate in their lives and in their stories, in their sitting with people, in their preaching, that they are connected into the everyday, ordinary life of the neighbors and communities where they live. And therefore, church, through its primary communication systems, keeps communicating, this is really alien ground from the rest of our lives. So there's some of the ways in which we've been addressing this.
Gosh, and we could talk an hour on just about all of it, but I do want to get back to a few of the things that you raised. And why don't we start with who's doing what, your second point. What's
right.
being communicated? Are we focused on God? Are you suggesting then that we relook at, because a lot of the folks who watch and listen, Alan, are pastors and church leaders who really do want to, because what you're describing, we're kind of cutting off our own arms. We're handicapping ourselves by not taking advantage of the gifts that are within the community. So how do we go about recognizing these and giving voice to these? And your second point about who is doing what, what's being communicated, are we focused on God? What ways do you suggest that gatherings can be more focused on God, and perhaps the leadership, if you will, would be dissipated so that God becomes more the focus instead of a star clergy person or whatever?
Sure. What we're talking about here is a fundamental change of imagination. And so this is not primarily about, here are 6 tactics for doing something new. Right. It really is a question of how do we as clergy, and I am a clergy person, how do we as clergy begin to see our world and our roles in a very different way? And again, I have to say things very briefly that require much more time. To a very large extent, across all of Protestantism, including Episcopalians, who are obviously pre-Reformation Protestants, clergy, certainly over the last century, have been trained fundamentally to be managers of an internal system. And that is what they know. And what they became good at was providing that management, whether it was pastoral care, preaching, teaching, hatching, matching, or dispatching.
Right.
They could provide all of that as long as people came. And when people stop coming, their anxieties go up and they work harder at the very things that they've been trained in. So I understand and have a great deal of empathy with the position in which clergy find themselves. Secondly, as congregations get into trouble, particularly as they age and or finances go down, congregational anxiety goes up. Yeah. And when congregational anxiety goes up, the congregation pushes back upon the clergy and says to them, work harder at what you're supposed to be doing. So there's a vicious cycle here. Yeah. And we've got to understand that, and it's got to be broken. I don't mean that in a violent way, but it's got to be broken. Which leads me to say that most clergy cannot go on this journey by themselves. This is not a solitary journey. The problem is that all of the training and all of the ethos the clergy have been given leads them deeply in this sola pastora model. So, in answering your question, I'll be honest with you, one of the critical things is for clergy to say, you know what, he's right. They may not say that, that's fine. We do need to learn new skills, new habits, new attitudes. We do need to learn new ways of being leaders. And I don't care how old you are, it's got nothing to do with that. In order to do that, you've really got to come together in some kind of cluster or cohort of other clergy to enter a co-learning kind of experience together. Without those things, I don't think anything's going to happen or anything's going to really change, because we as clergy have to go through our own very powerful adaptive change, to use that language. Now, part of it, and again, I'm speaking from what I've experienced from clergy, part of it is the rebirth of the belief that God is actively present in my parish or congregation, that God is up to something, and that what God is up to is not a function of me and is not a measure of my shadow. And therefore, one of the primary roles that I have as a clergy person is I become a detective of divinity. My primary role is, how do I attend to what God is up to amongst the people of God themselves? Now that gets back to some of the things I've described to you. How do you create safe spaces? How do you create listening engagements? How do you, every time you come together, not in a programmatic way, but how do you reintroduce things like Lectio Divina? That's sitting before Scripture and saying, how do we learn again to listen together, to give your people the confidence that God is at work there? And as you do that, how do you begin listening to the tentative, tender intimations in your people who are beginning to say, you know, God might be saying, or God might be calling. And as you watch those shoots come up, how do you begin to nurture them and love them? And so the other image I have of a clergy person is that we are midwives. We are watching what God is gestating in order to help it give birth. Now, this is the very opposite of the primary leadership models that are being presented. And I think a lot of clergy are bamboozled and are really depressed when they look at the leadership models that are out there, because they know they can never get there. But here's the good news. God never created the church to be led by A-type male personalities on high testosterone. That's not who it was. God created a church of ordinary men and women, and so there's a different leadership model to be had. So again, I'm going on too long, so let me stop.
I don't know if you're going on too long. You're certainly raising points to question. I want to go back to this idea that you began with, which is a fundamental change of imagination.
That's right, yes.
Is what you're seeing. And you described for us what seminaries put out and our traditions put out, which is often clergy as managers. If
Correct.
you could use a moniker then for something that's not working, might be clergy as managers, something that is then needed to further the mission of God would be what?
Well, if clergy not as managers, then I would say clergy as abbots, clergy as gardeners, clergy as environmentalists. Those would be the primary metaphors that I would use, and I can tell you stories where this is happening and where this is taking place.
Sure.
That's part of the shift of imagination. I would describe it as clergy who are learning to get out of their offices and out of their church bubbles and enter the neighborhoods and communities where they live. Which don't misunderstand me, and I don't mean this to be inappropriate. That is a huge boundary for many clergy to cross.
Well, yeah, and you look at, I mean, when I was in seminary, I remember I did part of my study in England, and there were some statistics we ran across, Alan, that talked about the high percentage of introverts and people who really are fed more by alone time than by people time, and that being a high percentage of people who enter clergy work.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm an introvert, but my basic pastoral response is get over it. You see, here's the thing that I mean, it's changing. I mean, I think the generations are changing this, but you know, if you came into this thing with a sense of what a wonderful life, my study, my books, my meetings with a few visits. Man, what a wonderful life. Here's what I want to say to you. It's gone. It's just gone. And it's not coming back. And if you can't retool, go find another job. Now that doesn't mean that we as clergy should not be living inside the text and learning the text and all of that. I don't mean that. But I do mean that whole notion of how warm and comfortable it was. I remember this when I started 30 years ago, that I could spend 3 mornings in my office. Whoops. I could spend 3 mornings in my office, go visit in the afternoon, go play late afternoon, go back for meetings. I mean, you know, yes, it used to work. It's not the world anymore.
So what's describe the schedule that you see being more nourishing?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is all of that's dependent upon lots of things. The schedule is definitely going to be spending a huge amount of more time with people, but it's different kind of time. It is again, think of the table. The table is the place where people are safe and they gather, and it's where you can begin to listen and call forth the narratives, the lives, and the conversations that are in them. That's a different orientation. It's not primarily pastoral care. It's not kind of, quote, looking after people's needs. It's much more being that detective of what God is up to. It's a whole lot more about what I call practices of Christian life. How do we begin to cultivate amongst our people some of the basic practices of Christian life? How do we begin to invite our people into things like daily office and the rhythms of Christian life? These are all ancient traditions that are not alien to what we call pastoral work, but they go deep into the office of that kind of leadership. How do you begin to reintroduce all of that? Now, that's going to require a lot of experimenting and a lot of inviting people into risk and experiment together. Spending time in the neighborhood. In a program I teach with my colleague Mark Labranson, we have D-Min students who come into a 4-year cohort, and we tell these clergy that by the end of the 2nd year, they've got to negotiate a minimum of 20% of their time in their neighborhood and community. So that's when it all starts to get reoriented. Am I making sense?
You're making a lot of sense, and I'm going to call on you because you did mention that you've got a lot of stories, and you do travel around the Anglican Church of Canada, which I've been to as well, and I've noticed the low rates of attendance and who's attending and that kind of thing. And I wonder if you could pull out of your vast storehouse of practical examples. Where are some places that you can describe for us where you're seeing these energy spikes, if you will, taken advantage of, and how does that look?
Sure. I can describe. Well, here's how it looks. Let me tell you a story. It's a really beautiful story because it illustrates so many churches. This particular congregation in mid-America is an aging congregation that when you sit amongst the people and the leadership, they'll look at you and they'll say, "Al, this missional stuff sounds good, but look at us. What are we supposed to do?" And when you say to them, "Well, what do you want to do?" They said to me, "Well, we want more young people in our church. We want more young families in our church." You've heard all of this before. And I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And they went down the list. They said, "Well, we could hire a youth pastor, but we can't afford that anymore. We can open a room in our basement as a drop-in center, but nobody's going to come." And they went down the list. And so I said to them, "Well, how many of you have grandchildren?" And they almost all raised their hands. "And how many of your grandchildren go to church?" Hardly anybody, right? So I said, "What would it look like if you just began to do some interviews with your grandchildren?" Pretty easy, right? Now I said, if you want to do that, I want to introduce you to something else. And I introduced them to Lectio Divina. I didn't call it that. I called it dwelling in the Word. And we use Luke 10 because that's a classic passage of the sending of the 70. And then I helped them devise some questions. At which point I said, rather than going to interview your own grandchildren, why don't you interview each other's grandchildren? And they went, and they came back, and they were higher than kites. They'd had the best time in their lives. And they began to tell the stories of the conversations they were having with their grandchildren. And finally, one of them said, well, you know, the truth is, what I've learned is they're not going to come to this church. And you could feel the heaviness descend again. And I said, well, keep talking about that. And again, this was over time. This was dwelling in the Word. This was using Luke 10. I'm being the detective of divinity. And I'm helping the clergy person understand this. Finally, they began to say, but we've discovered something. What's that? Our grandkids love to talk to us. Yeah, they do, don't they? What would it look like to keep talking to them? Well, why don't we? And they kept talking to them. And as they kept talking to them, these 80-year-olds entered into a whole new level of conversation with grandchildren about God and began to discover that they were going to have to reinvent church if they're going to reach those people. That's one story. Right. Give you a second story. Another parish, out of this listening to one another, out of this lectio, another parish just looked at each other and said, we don't know anybody in our community. We just drive in here. We haven't a clue who lives here, and we have no idea how to go do it. And as they were doing that, somebody said, but you know, we rent this building out to all kinds of groups that use it all the time, and we never connect with anybody. So why don't we take the listening that we've learned and the ways of attending to others that we've learned and the ways of listening to God, why don't we just go and meet with some of the leaders of these groups in our churches and just sit with them and learn to listen to what they're up to and what they're doing? So I could go on and on and on and on. And that begins to change the energy of a congregation. And it's not a huge program that you lay on a congregation. In fact, if I had more time, I'd say, if you want to change the culture of a congregation or a parish, don't create programs to change the culture of a congregation or parish. It's these small ways that seem small that you begin to change the imagination of culture. And I could tell you lots more stories. Is this what you're asking for?
Well, yeah, I think it is, because, you know, a number of the folk who, as I say, who listen, and I'm certainly biased because I'm the pastor of a congregation too. You know, we grapple with these. You know, you describe the edginess and the fear and the anxiety of the kids not coming, the grandkids not coming, and yet there are younger people present, and yet there is some energy that we have, or we wouldn't be going on anymore if it was completely
right.
dead.
Exactly.
But what you're describing is really imaginative ways of listening.
Well, yes. What I'm describing is something else. It's also start where your people are, not where you want them to be.
Yeah.
And so you say there's energy amongst your people. Absolutely. How do you begin to attend to that energy? Because that's where God is. So a huge principle for me is start where people are. Yeah. Now what that means is, and this is going to sound very strange, what I want to say to clergy is take all your vision statements and all your mission statements and put them in file 13. Put them away in the garbage. Because if you're honest with yourself, the only people that are interested in those are you and a few early adopters. And they've got nothing to do with what's going on in the midst of your congregation. Start where your people are. Sit amongst them. Listen. Attend. That's the first thing. Secondly, and I know you asked this question in one of the questions you asked, all the strategic plans that churches come up with are a huge royal waste of time in terms of attending to what God is up to amongst those ordinary human beings. So that's part of what I mean by a fundamental change of imagination. It's about where the primary locus of God's activities and energies are. And the primary locus of those energies and activities are not in a meeting of the parish council with the clergy, with newsprint designing the next 3 years. It's in the midst of and amongst the ordinary men and women of the church. And so what I've been giving you are hints of some of the skills and the capacities and the attitudes that are required in clergy to begin cultivating a different way.
And as you address this notion of listening, certainly in its best form, people who are proponents of strategic planning, if you will, are trying to find ways to record what people believe God is doing in them and in their congregation, and are trying to find ways to order resources and assets and direct things, and so it seems a bit I don't want to say judgmental, but I mean you're obviously you've thought this through, and this is something that you share on a regular basis. But I mean I wonder if there is a middle ground, a way that you see our own ways of organizing ourselves based on the loci that you're directing us toward, which is hearing where is God working here.
Sure. And the language may be tripping us up here, but the strategic planning is fundamentally a child of modernity.
You don't read about the strategic plan that Paul set out, do you?
You don't read about it. And it is in a book I've written called Missional Map Making. A lot of this is written down there, so I won't go over this. But please don't forget that strategy or strategic comes out of the work of someone, of Otto von Bismarck, who is forming the Prussian army. And it's a way of managing and organizing in order to achieve a certain set of goals. And, you know, if I'm building a house or I'm going on a journey, I want to have a strategic plan. I want a map. I want to know how to get there. So obviously there's a place for that. And I'm fully aware of it. But when you apply strategic planning to human social communities like parishes and congregations in the midst of massive disruptive change, it is a myth, and it is non-real for all kinds of reasons that I write about. But several pieces to say. Number one, strategic planning, even when it has all the sexy feedback loops in it that people want to create, is based on gap theory, the assumption that we are at point A and we want to get to point Y. The problem with that is that we no longer live in a world where we know what point Y is, and we no longer live in a world where there's a straight line. It was interesting, in the New York Times yesterday, in their magazine section, the front page of the magazine section was entitled, "Who Changed the Rules?" And it has a picture of a straight line going towards a sunset. And the rules were, this is a generational thing, the assumption that in the American dream, from the mid part of the last century on, if you worked hard, if you were moral, and you got a good education, all the good things in life would come to you, and you could plan for it and get it. That's strategic planning. Now it shows a sunset, but it shows lines weaving all over the place, crossing each other, intersecting. In other words, we don't know what the rules are anymore. We don't know what it all looks like. That's the world that we've moved into. And strategic planning isn't going to help you in that kind of world. You need a different kind of approach. That's one thing. Secondly, the whole problem with strategic planning, particularly in the hands of people who are not particularly sophisticated, is that, intended or not, it turns human beings into objects of some end. And the moment you turn human beings into objects of some ends, you are universes away from the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, again, there's an if, a both and here. If I, as a clergy person, when I had people come to me and say, Al, in the work we've done, in the discerning we've done, in the listening to God that we've done, we believe some of us in this congregation are being called to develop halfway housing for men. I want to know what the strategic plan is. So I'm not saying there's no place for it, but at the front door, in the midst of disruption, it completely misguides.
Yeah. And so you and for the benefit of those who are not familiar with the book you referred to that has to do with maps,
right?
Is strategic planning then? You kind of compare that to what a map might look like, and a map being more appropriate than a strategic plan. Could you talk about that?
Well, a classic strategic plan is what I've described. You create a mission statement, you create a vision statement. Our church wants to be such and such over the next 5 years, and then you create alignments, blah, 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 blah. All that I've said undermines that. So the argument I'm making is that we've lived in a world where we've assumed there was a fairly clear map of how to be successful.
Right.
So we talked earlier about clergy, the office, the visitation. They had a map of how to be successful.
Right.
We talked about people in our parishes now who assume that education, etc., gave them a map of how to be successful. So maps live inside of us and shape our imagination. And we have those maps. What I'm saying is, we have entered a world, we've entered a space where, to a large extent, the maps that we bring with us no longer describe the terrain in which we're traveling.
Right.
And therefore, instead of looking for the map with the answer, we've got to become map makers. Map makers is not about a strategic plan. It's about a whole different way of journeying together and discovering. Alongside of that, this is my theological read of what is going on in the churches. My theological read, which is based upon the first 12 chapters of Acts, is that God, the Spirit of God, is disrupting the settled assumptions of most post-Reformation Protestantism in North America. And the ways in which we've done church and assumed church are being disrupted. And we are being pushed out into spaces that we've never been before. My theological reading is that's God's action.
Yeah.
It is not simply demographic change. It is not simply globalization. It is not postmodernity, it's not all that stuff. This is the work of God. And that the Spirit of God is pushing us out into spaces where almost all of our old answers no longer make sense. Now, when you get out into those spaces, like Israel and Egypt, or like Israel and Babylon, what you want to do is work harder at what once made you successful.
Right.
That's why strategic planning is so attractive. But it won't work in the desert. It won't work in Babylon. It won't work in these spaces where the Spirit is pushing us.
It may give you some temporary sense of control, if you will.
Like megachurches. You see, you can get an alpha male leader to stand up and strategic plan and tell you what it all needs to look like. And a lot of people, especially middle-class Anglo-Saxons, with high levels of anxiety will crowd to that place because the place is telling them it's all going to be okay. But it's not. God is disrupting the church. But here's the good news. If God is disrupting the church and the Spirit of God is pushing the church into spaces where it no longer has answers, then the good news is God isn't finished with us. And the good news is the place to look for God's future is in those struggling little experiments of men and women who find themselves in places without maps. The place not to look, the place to avoid like the plague, are all those churches on the web that are telling you they've found the answer and here's how to do it. So, well, I'm pretty passionate about that stuff.
I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell. You leave me kind of speechless. But I want to go back to what you know, this way that you're describing the disruption that's going on, because, you know, you go to churches enough and you hear people talk about the advent of secularism and how detrimental that is to the enterprise of spreading the Christian gospel. When your take on it is that, look, you know, one of the best things about about what's happening today is secularism, because it's forcing us into places where we're dependent on God. It's forcing us onto places where our own plans, our own gizmos, our own maps, if you will, our own best intellectual forays into describing and planning where we're going isn't worth a hill of beans. And,
that is correct.
And that what you seem to be calling us to do, to go back to the beginning of our interview, are places in which we listen.
You know, here's the thing. We're entering Advent. Remember the story of that little girl, young woman, I suppose, and her husband, and that little baby, born in utter obscurity, who come to this blind man. Was he blind? Was it Zacharias? Who, you know, when we stand up and say the Nunc Dimittis, you see, this is where I live. It is this utter expectation that God's unbelievable future is gestating and present in all the ordinariness and everydayness and locality of the men and women in our parishes. That's where it's going on. And so it is this passionate expectation. That's where God's up to stuff. And I think most of us as clergy have lost that basic sense of conviction. And it is, let me put it in as stronger terms as I can, it is a functional atheism. Because you see, if Advent teaches us anything, it is that over and over and over and over again, God turns up in the ordinary and the everyday and the hidden and the obscure. And so, yeah, that's what drives me. That's what gives me passion. That's why I think most of the books that get written on how to fix the church and how to make the church grow are completely missing the point of what God's actually up to.
Right. Because it always comes from the unexpected. It always comes from places where we're not looking. And so to be, if you will, to use your term, detectives of the divine, means really to pay more attention to, and the Advent story is so perfect for this, especially when we look deeper at exactly where was this place God decided when God decided to come here, exactly who were these people in the context of other people who were living at the time. The Hallmark view of where the Hallmark greeting card view of what Christmas looked like, it couldn't be farther from the truth. And that's that functional atheism, I think, that you're getting to. We like to take comfort and draw strength, if you will, from these stories that get blown up into things that really are not depictions of what really happened, because as you've described, what really happened was something that was born in obscurity.
Utter obscurity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, listen, our time's drawing to an end. You've given us some wonderful things to think about, especially as you say, as we begin Advent and move into this new year. I always like to take some time at the end, Alan, to open it up and to ask if there's something you'd like to comment on that I haven't asked about, if there are some points that you'd like to elaborate on, perhaps I didn't allow you to, and to leave us, if you will, with a sense, perhaps a challenge, perhaps some words to dwell on as we ponder where God and how God is shaking up the church and how we, as people of God, are called to respond.
There is a wonderful text in Ezekiel, this obscure prophet. In Ezekiel, if I can contemporize it, was a temple prophet, a temple priest. And he was struggling with the fact that the temple and all that went on there was no longer the center of life, like many clergy do today when they sit in their offices. And remember that Ezekiel had this strange psychedelic dream. And the dream is of the wheels inside the wheels inside the wheels. And when the dream is over, God interprets the dream for him. And to put it in probably oversimplified language for today, what God said to Ezekiel, the temple prophet, the clergy person, well-trained at seminaries in America and England, what God said to him was, Ezekiel, I've left the temple and I got a whole new set of wheels. And if you want to find me, I'm out there at the brook. And Ezekiel had to. And he went out. And you may remember that the first thing he did before anything else was he crawled up in the fetal position and got depressed. But that wasn't the end of the story. However, here's what I think is going on. That after hundreds of years of a certain form of church, I call it kind of a Eurocentric Protestantism, he's left the temple and got a new set of wheels. But that doesn't mean that we, congregations, parishes, denominations, clergy, it doesn't mean it's over.
Right.
It means we got to go out there and join where God is. And for me, I don't use this big missional language in congregations. I try to say, how do you translate that to where people are? And to me, it's about how do you join God in the neighborhood? And so my encouragement to clergy is, God's up to something big. But you're going to have to enter the neighborhoods and communities where you live and see it in the ordinary. And if you start to do that, there's an amazing future ahead.
And it's really quite a call to humility, isn't it? It's because you look on the walls, you can see behind me, I'll show you some of my diplomas there, and you look behind, your wall I'm sure would have 10 times more. But it really is saying that, those really are not what matters. What matters is the activity of God here and now.
They're important. I am a huge believer, particularly for clergy, in our learning, in our continuing education. I'm a huge believer in theological education. So nothing that I've said takes that away.
Right.
It all gets applied in a very different way.
Well, as you mentioned, we could go on for quite a long time, and I'm certainly very thankful for the time that you spent with us, Alan. Thanks so much for joining us on Grow My Church.
Thank you so much. God's peace to you.